Thank you. In an effort to generate conversation and connection to a larger and complex history, my co-authors and I would like to acknowledge our gathering on Dakota land and recognize the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota and Ojibwe nations. In recognition of the complex and layered history surrounding the Lake Benton area, my co-authors and I would like to acknowledge the area discussed in this paper as the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the sovereign Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people, and all Indigenous people, past and present, who call that area home. Furthermore, this paper explores culturally sensitive features, some of which are the locations of ancestral remains. Consequently, we have chosen not to identify the precise locations of some of these features. In the summer of 2022, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Cultural Resource Management undertook a literature review, visual inspection, and field survey of segments of a proposed utility project in Lake Benton, Minnesota. This project was coincident with several previously reported archaeological sites, one of which was an alpha site. Minnesota classifies alpha sites as locations of historically documented archaeological sites that have not yet been confirmed by modern professional archaeologists. As a result, such sites are assigned a letter rather than a number. For example, 21 LNM, M is in Michael. This is the site that I will be discussing today. This particular alpha site was the purported location of a pre-contact Native American mound and was also coincident with a historic cemetery, the name of which is being withheld to protect the site. During field investigation, a visual inspection of this particular cemetery was conducted to determine if any evidence of a pre-contact mound might be visible. To our surprise, a large round pile of soil covered in manicured grass was situated in the center of this particular cemetery. This feature was ovoid in plan, measuring approximately 14.6 meters from north to south and 14 meters from east to west. It had a flat top, estimated to be approximately 1.1 meters above the surrounding landform. It was located on the summit of a broad rolling hill and was clearly constructed atop that natural landform. This location affords a fairly clear view of Lake Benton, obstructed only by the tops of tall trees planted in residential yards. The feature is surrounded by gravel roads and marked graves within the historic cemetery. This cemetery, again, the name is being withheld to protect the location of the possible mound, has been actively utilized from the late 19th century to the present day. A flagpole has been placed in the center of the feature, and a large stone memorial was placed in an alcove that had been previously excavated in its north end. A brief informal discussion with the cemetery's caretaker suggested that a local resident from Lake Benton may have erected the flagpole in the first half of the 20th century. The caretaker recounted a local legend that Native American human remains had been encountered during the excavation for the flagpole, contributing to lore suggesting the feature was a Native American burial mound. It's not every day that unconfirmed pre-contact mound sites are identified. Likewise, such sites pose challenges as they must be studied in a non-invasive manner, respecting them as they may be the locations of ancestral remains. Consequently, my co-authors and I were faced with a challenge to determine if what we were seeing was in fact a mound and to provide documentation to support our conclusions. Properly contextualizing this feature at 21 LNM required a thorough archival and literature review, coupled with a geospatial analysis and comparison with other extant mound sites nearby. To do so, we first searched for historic documentation of any mound situated at this particular location. Next, we identified historically recorded accounts of other mounds surrounding Lake Benton. This permitted us to contextualize the range of mound shapes, sizes, and locations as reported in the past. Next, we examined these locations with modern geospatial methods to determine the accuracy of the historical accounts and the maps. Finally, we attempted to determine if the feature in the cemetery might be a pre-contact mortuary mound requiring a site update and protection. This work is ongoing, having morphed from a compliance-based investigation into a research-based project, as my co-authors and I continue to track sources and attempt to better understand this feature and the cultural landscape within which it existed. Several different historic sources and documents and sources discuss the pre-contact mounds and earthworks identified in the Lake Benton area. The earliest of these sources, the earliest of these sources dates from 1879. Here, an article in the Lake Benton Times dated September 12, 1879, mentioned that mounds were present in the area surrounding Lake Benton. The article, summarized in an edited volume by the newspaper's editor, A.E. Tasker, described disturbance to a mound on a nearby bluff claiming that it had contained human skeletal remains. Furthermore, the author stated, quote, "A thorough exploration of the Lake Benton mounds has not yet been made." But he also claimed, quote, "Excavations were made later," which kind of confuses things. Unfortunately, the precise location of any of these mounds, as well as their status, their exact status at the time that they were mentioned, was not described. Between 1879 and 1882, Warren Upham surveyed the geology and pre-contact earthworks surrounding Lake Benton. In 1884, he described two locations with mounds. The first was a series of 3 mounds northwest of Lake Benton. The second was a single mound, quote, "about 5 feet high in the center of the cemetery." This appears to be the first instance where a mound in the cemetery is specifically mentioned. In describing other mounds, Upham noted their township, range, section, and quarter section. Yet with this mound, he only located it in the center of the cemetery. This is likely because, from his perspective and his worldview, the cemetery was a well-defined landmark, as opposed to a remote, undeveloped prairie hilltop, again, from his perspective. In 1911, Newton Winchell, who previously hired Upham to complete the 1884 survey, published an extensive study of mounds throughout Minnesota with Jacob Brower, Alfred Hill, and T.H. Lewis. This volume quoted Upham's 1884 chapter regarding the presence of a mound in the center of the cemetery near Lake Benton. Unfortunately, Winchell did not elaborate further regarding the mound. The mound within the cemetery was next discussed within an article in the Lake Benton News dated August 12, 1927. Here, the article noted the presence of several mounds in the area around Lake Benton and stated, quote, "In the exact center of the cemetery is a mound which originally was somewhat larger than it is at present." The article mentioned one additional mound group in the Lake Benton area, noting that it had been reduced in size by cultivation and that disturbances to some of the mounds in the area had uncovered human remains. This particular mound is then again discussed in Tasker's 1936 book, when Tasker added a notation claiming, quote, "One mound which has been considerably diminished in size by excavation about its base is located in the exact center of the cemetery." 1940, the mound in the cemetery is mentioned again, this time by Wilford. In his memo regarding Lincoln County, Minnesota, he stated that a mound is located in the same cemetery near Lake Benton. Wilford believed the mound in the cemetery was one of 2 mounds in the group studied by T.H. Lewis in September 1884, and that was included in Winchell's 1911 work. Lewis's cartographic location of this particular mound group was directly adjacent to the western limit of the cemetery. Consequently, Wilford associated this particular mound group with the cemetery, claiming, "This is the location of the cemetery." Winchell speaks of 2 mounds, but only one is now here, as the other has apparently been removed. Associating the group of 2 mounds identified by Lewis in 1884 with this cemetery mound might appear to work, but there are several issues. First, Upham's 1884 chapter described a mound in the cemetery. His field visit to the site was conducted between 1879 and 1882, suggesting that by 1882, the, quote, "cemetery mound" would have been, at the very least, adjacent to marked graves or some other indication of a post-contact cemetery. Field notes compiled by T.H. Lewis on September 27, 1884, made absolutely no mention of a post-contact cemetery or graves. In 1911, Winchell replicated Lewis's notes, and here makes no mention of a post-contact cemetery or marked graves either. Likewise, both Lewis and Winchell described and presented a map of a group of 2 distinct mounds, possibly coincident with the cemetery, as suggested by Wilford. Yet Upham in 1884 only described one single mound in association with the cemetery. Accounting for this discrepancy is difficult. Perhaps Upham had not noticed a second mound, or perhaps Upham had not visited the mound or mounds at the cemetery at all. Notably, in mentioning the mound, Upham attributed its location to the center of the cemetery instead of providing the full township, range, section, and quarter section, as he did for other mounds. Later in 1927, and again in 1936, Tasker described a single mound that had been disturbed and reduced in size, located in the center of the cemetery. A 1938 aerial photo of the cemetery displays only one mound situated in the center. In 1940, Wilford believed that the second mound had apparently been removed. If this were the case, which mound, northern or southern, had been removed, or were these mounds actually 2 different sites? This is entirely possible, as Winchell quoted Upham in 1884 regarding the mound in the cemetery, yet he also separately described a group of 2 mounds located nearby to the west. To address these questions, we employed modern geophysical methods such as a 1-meter LiDAR hillshade to search for evidence of another mound in the cemetery. An examination of the hillshade topography can provide more detail than simple aerial photos can. As a proof of concept, we examined a different site, 21LN5. This is another mound group situated somewhere else in Lincoln County. Again, we're not describing its precise location to help protect it. This group had been visited originally and described by T.H. Lewis in September 1884, and later Winchell in 1911 described the site and provided a sketch of 4 mounds, likely based on T.H. Lewis's sketchbook. And he also provided some rudimentary dimensions as well. A view of the modern ortho photo seen on the right really doesn't show much detail. However, a map of the LiDAR seen here, which detects and amplifies relief across the landscape, clearly shows much more detail. When compared with the sketch map and locational information recorded by Lewis in 1884, it is clearly one and the same site. After using 21LN5 as a proof of concept, we then examined 21LNM and 21LN6 to better understand those 2 sites. No sketch map of the mound within the cemetery has been identified thus far. Regardless, the modern ortho photo clearly shows a feature in the center of the cemetery. This feature really pops on the LiDAR hillshade, but no evidence of any lumps or bumps are near it, suggesting that perhaps this is really a lone mound. The reported location of site 21LN6 is a bit more challenging. Lewis, repeated later by Winchell, described the location to the quarter section, an area of 40 acres. This particular spot is generally unlike the other descriptions of locations with mounds around Lake Benton. Almost all the historical accounts and sources describe the mounds as situated on the summits of hills overlooking the lake. This does not mean that mounds were never placed in other locations, but that from our initial review of the Lake Benton area, they were typically situated on high points surrounding the lake. The 40 acres where Lewis identified the presence of these 2 particular mounds is generally a wide, gently sloping ravine or drainage. From here, the view of Lake Benton is not very clear, and there are higher points in the landscape situated nearby. Take, for example, the cemetery. The Minnesota site files identify the entire 40-acre quarter section as the location of the site, citing Lewis, Winchell, and Wilford. However, handwritten notes on the site file forms, as well as correspondence with Minnesota Office of State Archaeology personnel, have questioned Wilford's conclusion that a second mound existed at the cemetery, but had been leveled by the time of his visit in 1940. So a comparison of the sketch presented by Winchell in 1911 on the left with the modern ortho photo fails to provide any conclusion either way. However, let's take a look at the LiDAR. Searching the LiDAR hillshade in the area of the quarter section displays a hint of a slight rise above the landscape. It's really not much. However, a review of the historic 1938 aerial photo for that part of the county displays 2 low rises in that location. The northern of the 2 rises is situated in the very corner of the exact quarter section described by Lewis in 1884. A field visit is recommended to better contextualize these rises and to determine if they may be pre-contact mounds. If these 2 rises are indeed the mounds visited by Lewis, then the feature in the center of the cemetery is a separate site. Accounts of the features situated in the cemetery are similar to the descriptions of mounds found throughout the area. For example, it, like other mounds, was situated atop a hill overlooking Lake Benton. Likewise, its shape and dimensions were similar to others nearby. For these reasons, the feature situated in the center of the cemetery is likely a pre-contact mound disturbed during the late 19th and or early 20th century, or both. These historic sources attest to the presence of numerous mounds, some isolated, some situated in groups, that comprised a cultural landscape surrounding Lake Benton. Although the compliance-driven investigation has concluded, our research-based investigations have not. We plan to intensify our archival research, expanding our scope to contextualize the broader cultural landscape situated around Lake Benton. Additionally, we hope to collaborate with descendant populations to incorporate traditional knowledge, oral history, and an indigenous perspective into this collaborative contextualization. This project demonstrates the importance of following up on alpha sites and the necessity of applying non-intrusive geospatial methods to better understand sites and contextualize them as components of broader cultural landscapes. Finally, we would like to thank the organizers of this conference. It's going off really smoothly. All errors are, of course, are. Thank you.